The main culprit in the dumping sewage is none other than the municipal sewer systems. The government itself is the major river dumper. So what you have is a system where essentially municipal governments are providing sewage service for free. Of course, they're doing it as a taxpayer, but the user doesn't really pay for it. And then, of course, everybody uses it. If this didn't occur, if you had a proper pricing system, if you had private ownership of the rivers and a proper pricing system, then you would turn more and more to things, for example, like chemical toilets. There are, even right now, technologically there has been developed a super chemical toilet which completely eliminates all pollutants. I mean, no pollution gets out, no water pollution, no air pollution, no nothing. But of course, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to buy? Who's going to invest in a chemical toilet where they can turn the good old free municipal government for the sewage system? And the sewage system can in turn dump it in the good old free government-owned communist, quotes, river. So again, we have a situation developed where private ownership is not allowed in a river resource, which is an important resource. As a result of that, not only is it not used properly, but there's no incentive to develop technology to preserve the river. I mean, who knows? If the Hudson River were owned by a corporation, they probably would have found a way by this time to allow stuff to be dumped on the river and then quickly clean it up and recycle it or whatever, and preserve the river for all these different uses, for beaches and for, which of course, I mean, nobody's swum without taking their life in their hands the Hudson River for about 60 years. And if the river were owned by somebody, they would want to maximize either the highest value of their revenue, first of all, to use the river for the highest economic resource, and secondly, if they can possibly do it technologically, to allow all these things to take place. Industrial use and then recycle it and somehow clean it up, and then allow the beach use and residential use and pleasure craft and whatever. The law does exist right now in the western states which permit private ownership of the rivers. There are two kinds of water law. There's the old common law, riparian common law, which is pretty unfortunate, because what it said was, again, the common law was evolved, of course, in the days when the river was not considered a scarce resource. So you had something like freedom of the seas in the sense that if you happen to own a piece of land abutting a river, then you own that part of the river, which doesn't make too much sense. So this is riparian ownership. As a result, you might have 300,000 owners of this river, each one only because he happens to be sitting near it and looking out at it, which doesn't seem to be a very useful kind of definition of ownership. And then, of course, you can't really do much of anything in that situation. On the other hand, this riparian water law has been adopted by the eastern states. On the other hand, the western states adopted the so-called appropriation form of water ownership, which is almost geared toward this kind of private property in rivers that we've been talking about. The appropriation theory is that, of course, in the western states, it's very dry, so there's a lot of use of irrigation and so forth. If you start using, say, 10% of the flow of the river at a certain point, then you own 10%. You have the rights to 10%. The next guy has the rights to the second 30% or whatever. And the allocation then is a sort of a private property basis. The problem is with appropriation theory is that first of all, the government regulates it very severely. You can't use it for this, you can't use that for that, etc. And second of all, you can't transfer the ownership. In other words, if I happen to have the rights to the first 10% of a river flow, I can't sell it. I have to give it back. If I want to stop using it, I have to give it back to the government. As a result, there's no real market or full private property has been allowed even in the western situation. But it's pretty clear that you can start with a western appropriation system and move pretty quickly to a full private property in either the whole river or parts of the river. It'd be interesting to discuss that, what the technological unit of the river is. I'm not really sure. I'm sure that could be worked out if we all have the end in mind, the object in mind of establishing private property in the water resources. If somebody owned Lake Erie, everybody's griping about Lake Erie, but if somebody really owned it, then you wouldn't be able to pollute it because the Lake Erie owner would take you to court and sue you, etc., take out an injunction. In order to be able to pollute Lake Erie, you have to make an agreement with the Lake Erie owner and pay him for allowing you to pollute, which means that you then have the optimum amount of pollution, in quotes. In other words, the polluter is then paying for his pollution. He's paying the cost of it. If it becomes too expensive, and it obviously will become much more expensive than now because now pollution is free. Now you can dump this stuff in Lake Erie because nobody owns Lake Erie. So if somebody owned it and then charged you for this pollution, the amount of pollution obviously decreased enormously, and certainly the amount of invasive pollution, in other words, aggressive pollution, would decrease to zero, or so now is whatever. It's hard to know how much it is now because nobody owns the river. That leads us to the final, probably the gutsiest in a way, form of pollution, which is air pollution. What about air pollution? Doesn't capitalist greed bring about air pollution, etc.? Well, first place, of course, we can say that one of the worst pollution problems is in Soviet Russia. You can't say capitalist greed is really responsible. And second of all, perhaps the biggest single air polluter is Con Ed, the monopoly utilities and so forth, which are government regulated and whatever. Hardly examples of free market activity. However, once again, what you have is a situation where Instead of capitalist greed being at full, the problem is the government has not allowed full use of private property, namely in your lungs and the airspace around your head, or around your orchards and around your property. This problem first came up in the middle and late 19th century when factories first came in. First factories come in, say around the mid-19th century. Somebody would set up a factory and they belched smoke. In those days we weren't sophisticated, we didn't know too much about nitrous oxide and all the rest of it, but they knew about smoke, boy. They could see the smoke pour out. They could see the smoke, they could breathe in the smoke, they didn't like it, and they could see the smoke injure the orchards and the grass and the trees of the farmers. So the farmers began to take the factories to court and say, look, we gotta either pay damages or stop it and get an injunction against an invasion of our property rights. At that point, the courts, now why they did this, nobody really knows yet, because this whole thing has only been investigated very, very recently when we became interested in air pollution. The courts began systematically to say, well, we realize, Farmer Jones, that you're really right, that this industry is invading your private property. However, and it's too bad, however, there's something more. We know, this is 1868 or whatever the year was. This is now progressive. We're no longer back in the old 18th century hidebound kind of framework. We now realize there's something more important than private property, and that's public policy. And public policy and the common good and the general welfare and all the rest of the jazz. And these things decree that factories are good things. We can't allow the development of factories to be limited and restricted by some crummy farmer's private property. Therefore, we will permit this to continue. And systematically the law was changed by the judges. The whole common law system of tort law and nuisance law and all the things which would have clobbered the polluting factories immediately before they hardly got started, all these laws were changed by the judges. Because before that, before, say, the Civil War period, any factory that pours smoke on a farmer, etc., could be, it's an invasion of property and get smashed. And the farmer can go in, get an injunction, stop it, and pay damages. But then they changed it systematically to say, well, because public policy, industry is important, etc., they changed the law to say the factory can only be paid damages, etc., if the factory is pouring more smoke than most of its fellow factory owners. Sort of an unusual smoke pourer, sort of maliciously doing it and so forth, then you can zap them. Otherwise, you can't. The thing is, it's only been discovered within the last couple of years that this has been done, the systematic change by the courts. It wasn't really done by statute so much as by judicial reinterpretation and Bowdlerizing of the common law. And the question is, why do they do it? And that hasn't been investigated at all yet. This is, as far as I know, this has been a great open area for historical research. Why do the courts systematically do this? And of course, I have my own hunches about it, which is they were in league with the manufacturers. But that has not yet been proven. I can only say this is the first place I would look if I were doing the study of it. So, we have the government changing the guidelines, saying, okay, we permit invasion of property in this area because it's industry and factories important. What's happened is over the last 100 years or so, the whole technology is of course geared toward a polluting technology, toward air pollution technology. My favorite analogy on this is, supposing the courts decided when trucks were first coming in, early 20th century, there was a traffic jam, the trucks started cutting across people's lawns in order to get to the other street. People would take their truck to court, and the court would say, well, it's too bad about your lawn, we really weep about it and so forth, but it's really more important for the society to get the truck through, and so therefore if the truck isn't really doing as significantly more damage to your lawn than other trucks, will allow them to keep doing it. If that were true, by this time you have a big lawn-crushing technology, and nobody would have any lawns at all. The trucks would be zipping over everybody's property. The whole system would be geared to it. And the same thing has happened in industry now, because the legal structure has been changed, because invasive pollution has been declared to be free and permitted by the courts. Industrial technology has been geared in that direction. What we have to do is to change this and establish private property once again in people's air and lungs and orchards, etc., so that technology will be then redirected toward a non-invasive, non-polluting technology. But it was the government that set this whole thing up by changing the common law structure. We see in every area that something peculiar has happened on the market, either a ravaging of a resource, undue depletion, pollution. In some way the market hasn't really functioned. It hasn't been because of the market, it hasn't been because of capitalist greed. It's been precisely because the market and private property has not been allowed to function by the government itself. Call upon the government itself to do the remedying is like, in one of my favorite analogies, call upon the fox to guard the chicken coop against predation. It's obviously the government that's the main problem in this whole business, and we should then call upon the government to allow private property to function in these areas as it has allowed in other areas, or at least even more so. At least to catch up to the other areas of the market, so that we don't have these extra problems messing up the system. Thank you.